Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Now, in previous shows we have discussed NASA's Apollo moon missions and presented a comprehensive set of evidence suggesting the Apollo crafts did not land on the moon. If you contend that statement, then please watch these two Rich Planet TV shows and see if you still hold that view after you've watched them. Now, in recent months I've been collaborating with researcher Douglas Gibson, who has been investigating more of NASA's claimed projects, namely the Mars exploration missions. Starting in 1976 and up to the present day, NASA have allegedly landed a series of landers and rovers on the Martian surface, which have allegedly sent back photographs and other data to the Earth. Now, I've been working on a hypothesis with the help of Douglas Gibson, which is now running at 50 pages, and you can download it from this link, and it is entitled A Hypothesis: The Opportunity and Curiosity rovers are situated on Earth. In fact, more specifically, the Mars exploration rovers are not situated on the surface of Mars and never left the Earth. As I say, you can download this 50-page document, this hypothesis, from the link on the screen. How many other TV shows would you get a 50-page hypothesis of evidence to back up what we're talking about? Now, here to discuss the claims in the hypothesis is researcher Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Richard.
Okay, now I mentioned the moon there, Andrew, and you're, I would say, convinced as you can be that the Apollo never went to the moon. And we've gone through a lot of that evidence as to why you think that. Where do you stand on these Mars missions, Andrew?
Well, it's very interesting to think about because, you know, I have done talks about the Mars missions as well, as you probably know, and some of the viewers perhaps have had a look around on the websites and stuff. So it kind of, you know, once you've broken through the Apollo barrier, if you want to call it that, and you realise that there's no possible way that they could have done what they did, what they claim to have done on the moon, then, you know, you do have to open up yourself to the idea that perhaps because of similar complications with technology, maybe these rover missions, you know, are not as claimed, certainly not as claimed. Mm-hmm. And kind of, I suppose, you know, you've rightly gone forward with your document mm-hmm. to try and explore where we get to when we look at the evidence and try and study it a bit more deeply with this deeply skeptical mindset that we come to, having found out some of the huge problems with the Apollo record.
I found the more I looked, the more the official version of the photographs, the official story behind them, started to fall apart. Right. And it's been 18 months now, and everywhere I look, it's the same as the Apollo missions. I know most people still believe we went to the moon, but if you look really carefully at any single aspect of the science, it just comes apart. In the introduction,
I set out the reasons why the reader should not just dismiss this hypothesis, because a lot of people will do that. And the reason they'll come up with is they'll say, well, why would they do that? There's no logical reason why they would possibly fake a mission to Mars. Well, let's look at the evidence before we decide why they've done it. Let's look at what happened before we look at why they may have done it.
Always a good method, yes.
Yeah, so investigation before condemnation. And we're going to do some of the investigating today. We'll just start by having a quick look at previous alleged missions to Mars. Now, we've got, from 1964 up to the present day, we've got a lot of attempted Mars missions, the majority of which actually failed. Yep. Most of these were either flybys or orbiters, and we've got a number of craft which are currently allegedly in orbit around Mars. It's all in this table on the screen there, and we've got a number of craft which have landed on Mars, starting with the Viking mission in 1976. Just tell us a little bit about the Viking mission, Andrew.
Yeah, so the Viking mission arrived at Mars in 1976, consisted of 2 orbiters and 2 landers, and they were landers rather than rovers. So they, you know, once they got onto the surface, they stayed in the same place. Mm-hmm. Those missions cost $1 billion. Mm-hmm. So, you know, going back to 1976, that's an awful lot of money. Mm-hmm. And they had colour cameras on them. They had a laboratory, chemical laboratory built into them. So one of the projects was to send an arm out into the soil, dig some soil, pull the soil into the, or dust, whatever you want to call it, pull it back into the probe and drop it down into like a sort of chemical analysis laboratory. And they did this labeled release experiment and so forth. So quite sophisticated probes. The missions we were told they were a success. Everything worked. They landed where they were supposed to land, and we got quite a lot of good quality pictures from them.
Right.
It was that mission which first photographed this alleged face on Mars from orbit, not from the surface. They photographed that from one of the orbiters in the region became known as Cydonia.
All right, well, we'll come on to some of the photographs which appear to have been tampered with from the Viking mission. Now, they conked out in the early 80s, they lost their power, what have you, and then we've got a gap up until the mid-90s where we have Pathfinder, and you can see the various different sizes of what were called the Rover missions. So these are vehicles which can allegedly move around the surface of Mars, starting, as I say, with Pathfinder in, I think it's 97.
That's right, 97.
Right, okay, so that only lasted for a year or two.
Yeah.
Then we've got another gap to the mid-2000s where we've got Spirit and Opportunity, which were a pair of rovers, which lasted lasted a good number of years. In fact, the Opportunity rover is still allegedly active. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's, we can see on the screen there the Opportunity rover, and then we then had the Phoenix
lander.
That was just a
lander. That's
lander.
Right. That was, that only operated, I think, for about 3 months or something. You've got that on your graph there.
Yeah.
So
And then the most recent one, which is Curiosity, which we're going to look at the Curiosity and the Opportunity rovers, which are allegedly still
sending back pictures from Mars. Allegedly, yes.
And moving around the surface of Mars. Now, I've got a section on the power ratings of the Opportunity rover, and in the document I compare it to a mobility scooter, because the weight of the Opportunity rover is 185 kilos, which is probably 2 largish people. So it's reasonably heavy.
Yes.
So you would imagine, if you were to compare it to, let's say, a mobility scooter, which I think is probably a good comparison.
Yes.
Obviously, things weigh less on Mars. I think it's a factor of 2.6 times less on Mars. So it's maybe not 185 kilos equivalent load, but a mobility scooter maybe has let's say an 80 kilogram person. It's comparable. Now, a mobility scooter typically consumes around about 500 watts of power. Now, the Opportunity rover is rated at just 100 watts, which is no more than a sewing machine. So, in the other thing which I go into detail in the document is how the batteries are charged with just 2 solar panels, which are delivering just 100 watts only for 4 hours a day, and this system has lasted for 10 years. Now, just think of your laptop battery, right? Because it's probably comparable. Or maybe something slightly larger. It lasting 10 years of charging and discharging.
The life of the batteries, because the Opportunity rover is supposed to have been roving around on Mars now for 10 years, powered by one rechargeable battery.
Lithium-ion battery.
Yes, and since when did those last 10 years?
You take those power figures and it does make you scratch your head a little bit. Of course they will argue, you've got highly optimized electronics and drive systems, and we use very low friction bearings in the motors, it's been specially designed for this project and so forth. But when you do the numbers, you start to, like you say, the 100 watts for 4 hours a day, and then also the solar panels, if they're providing 100 watts of power allegedly for, as you say, 4 hours a day, it doesn't seem very much. And also the thing that came into my mind is these things are on Mars, so the sunlight is going to be 20, 30, 40% weaker there. Allegedly the atmosphere is more dust laden, so how much more efficient have those solar panels got to be than they would have to be on Earth.
I mean, here's another interesting fact. The rover's operating temperature is -40 to +40 degrees centigrade. So presumably they've been tested to operate in that range. The average surface temperature of Mars is estimated to be -55 degrees C. That's the average temperatures of Mars. At the equator, which is obviously the hottest point, temperature varies from 20 degrees C maximum to -73 degrees minimum. so the temperature that they're on Mars at, -73, is way below the minimum operating temperature. So,
and that's right. And then you also consider it in terms of, if anybody has ever taken their radio out into cold weather, or a torch, trying to switch it on, you'll find that the battery performance at those sorts of temperatures is very much reduced. And it's literally got to put it in your pocket to get the battery going again with a pocket torch or whatever. Anyone can try that. So how are they getting this power system to work?
So the types of batteries used is a lithium-ion battery. So it's nothing special. It's what you would find in a lot of laptops and mobile phones. And it's lasted over 10 years, being charged and discharged probably every day.
Yeah.
And they're only charging it for 4 hours a day with a 100 watt max, probably, solar panel. So,
and I mean, I've pointed out with the Apollo missions, the Apollo rover that they used, the battery technology on that was operating way out of the specified temperature on the high end, on the moon, and that's in their own documents. So yeah, you've got some serious questions here, certainly.
And if we just go back to the comparison that I've made in the document, imagine putting a mobility scooter on the moon, right, with a couple of solar panels on it. How long is it going to last without plugging it into the mains? I don't buy it.
Right.
All right, let's have a look at the Curiosity rover. Now, this is a different beast altogether. It's much bigger, more sort of the size of a car, much more highly powered, and this is the one that there was big fanfare a few years back when it allegedly landed on Mars, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But uses a different power system, Andrew. This is using some sort of nuclear isotope power system.
The system, as I understand it, is basically uses some type of thermocouple, doesn't it, where you have the cool temperatures on the outside of the vehicle, and then you have the warmer temperature which is created by the radioactive decay from the isotope, and then you have a thermocouple set up between those 2 points, and that provides a current from the temperature difference. That's my understanding.
So
that works.
Right. I've said here, while it seems plausible that a radioisotope electric generator could provide enough energy to power Curiosity rover, the Opportunity rover seems unfit for purpose by comparison. So let's just talk about the testing of these vehicles, because I've worked in my career as an engineer for the best part of 20 years and been involved in a lot of testing of products. And what I set out in the document is the philosophy that you use when you test products, is in that you have a separate test department and design department, and they're not really supposed to collaborate with each other, because you look at the requirements of the product. The test department will have its own engineers who devise the test procedures and carry out the tests separate from the designers, because there's always a chance that both sets will interpret the requirements incorrectly, and therefore it will pass a test without complying with the requirements. So there's all these things, and the videos that I've seen put out by NASA, there just seem to be one big happy family there. It doesn't seem that they're doing independent type of testing that I could see in their videos.
Well, they appear to show some scientists working hard to develop the rovers, but there's absolutely no documentation, no film footage of any of the development stage, or very little documentation and footage of the development of the rovers. And particularly, of course, the landing stages. I think it's the Curiosity rover had a very complicated 6-stage landing procedure.
That was, we were discussing this earlier, and it does. I mean, from the videos they put out, it does look more like a PR exercise, and sort of, patting themselves on the back, rather than some type of rigorous, type of audit test where somebody is actually pinning these people down and checking that the systems meet the user requirements, you know, and that these systems are working as designed, you know.
I would expect a device like a Rover to probably have several test specifications, each with hundreds, if not thousands, of tests to test against mandatory requirements, all signed off. But all we've got is a few videos from NASA. We can look at this one that they've put out, which was the drop test.
Oh yeah.
So we'll just have a look at this now.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
So big fanfare, but what actually happened in that test? We saw something kind of lowered to the ground. Now, I've worked on systems which lower nuclear weapons into Trident submarines, right? And when we're testing that type of equipment, they're operating within, let's say, certain acceleration parameters and velocities. So you don't know that the thing's passed the test until you've got your test data back. Because what we used to do when I was at Faslane nuclear base, we put a 125-ton bag of water on the end of a crane and we drop it and then see if the braking system worked, and the accelerations will be measured, and then you wouldn't know until afterwards it's passed the test. You certainly wouldn't stand there clapping your hands. So it just I don't buy it, you know.
It's right. I mean, if you watch that video, which I think is the test of this so-called sky crane drop mechanism which was allegedly used in the landing of the Curiosity rover. Yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, you know, it's like they've set up this rig, they've dropped something down, and they're looking up, oh, it hasn't broken, you know, therefore it's passed the test, you know. So that's what it looks like to us. I mean, you know, again, but there may be things that we can't actually see, but why can't we see more of those, somebody, you know, going through a list of checkpoints, you know, on a list, or like you say, measuring the acceleration of this component and, you know, the stress on that component, you know, what have you. We don't really see that, certainly not in the video. So again, and I think one of the things we're talking about, Richard, isn't it, is having some type of independent verification of NASA's claims.
Now let's come on to the outside area where they've allegedly used to test some of these rovers, known as the Mars Yard. So we'll just put some photographs up on the screen, and it's not the most impressive test site in the world, is it? I mean, what are your thoughts on it, Andrew?
Well, like you say, I mean, you know, it's one of those things, a bit like the Apollo pictures. When you look at them, they seem plausible. When you look at this, it seems like a plausible test area. But when you were pointing out, for example, that your own experience of going on test sites for some of the projects you've been involved in the past, and I've been on one or two of those sorts of projects as well. Probably not to the extent that you have, but yeah, it's true. You would have some more. You'd have more security. You know, you'd have more equipment sort of set up. It doesn't really look that
as you said earlier, you're talking each of these rovers, whether they're the test rover or the actual rover, you're talking multi-millions of pounds each. So there's not even, doesn't even look like there's any security there, so someone could just come in and steal it. So it just doesn't look like a comprehensive environmental testing site to me. Right, well, we've yet to come on to the most damning evidence, by the way. I mean, this is really just background what we're discussing at the moment. A rocket was launched at Cape Canaveral on the 26th of November 2011, and it got to Mars in August 2012. And this was filmed, or the Curiosity team sitting behind their consoles, which I find a little bit intriguing, because you've got all of these operators sitting behind consoles, supposedly looking at different parts of the mission of this craft as it's going towards the surface of Mars. But we know that a signal from Earth to Mars takes at least 3 minutes, so that's 6 minutes to get there and to get back. So if they were to modify any sort of part of the mission, it's a 6-minute feedback loop. So they're not looking at a live image. So I would have thought the vast majority of the program to land the thing, or if not all of it, would have to be completely pre-programmed and automatic. So I asked the question, well, what are all these operators doing?
If if there's some buffeting in the atmosphere that this thing is going through, and they need to respond to it, then it's going to be 6 minutes later when this thing's already gone thousands of miles off course and potentially crashed. So they must have done some very good modelling and had a lot of good data as to how that thing was going to come down. I mean, I think when they have the press conference, which we're recommending that people watch that landing press conference. We're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute, but they say, I think within that, they say they landed within about 50 metres or something, or 500 metres of the target area, which is, if you're going all the way to Mars, that's pretty incredible.
Right.
Are they just good engineers and skillful people, with the mechanics and so on? But
there is a video which allegedly shows the craft kind of going down to the Martian surface, and then there's another photograph which they claim to be Curiosity rover on the end of a parachute. So how would, because people who would say that these missions did land on Mars, they would cite these two pieces of evidence, both the video and the photograph of with the parachute out taken by a Mars orbiter.
In some ways, the difference between the Apollo deception and the Rovers deception is CGI, which is why the pictures we're seeing now are so much more convincing. JPL themselves, the Jet Propulsion Lab, have actually developed software called Virtual Presence in Space technology, which is cutting edge CGI, beyond anything we've seen in the movies. Isn't anybody wondering why?
There's a conference, and I recommend you watch the whole conference, and this was the 2012 landing briefing, so it's the conference after they've supposedly successfully landed the Curiosity rover on Mars, and one of the main speakers there was this guy Adam Steltzner. So they were being asked questions by the press, and let's just have a look at this little clip of Adam Steltzner, who's one of the lead engineers. I think he supposedly devised the
Sky crane,
the method by which the thing is actually landing.
That's right. He was the guy who sort of pushed for the Sky crane system to be used. Yeah.
Right. So let's just take a look at this.
Adam, tell us about the landing.
All right, Greg. I can't tell you too much about it. I mean, it looks good. I'm being a little flip. In short, it looked extremely clean. We touched down in conditions that were on the more benign side of our nominal expectation. By the way, I want to preface everything. This is preliminary data scooped with the sieve in the cacophony of the control room during the celebration, right? And largely by my good friend Miguel San Martin, who's somewhere out there, I hope. At any rate, very nominal, remarkably good. Our navigation error was on the low side of our expectation.
What? I have to ask you, what kind of file type? Can you tell us about the image file type and compression that was used to send this very important couple of thumbnails back from Mars?
Yes, unfortunately, I absolutely cannot. If Justin Mackey is in the room, or there's a couple other people on the team who'd be able to whip that out quickly, but I couldn't tell you. Sorry.
So the guy, he doesn't even know what format the images are in that have been sent back to the Earth.
There's no evidence of any real science going on there, as far as I can see.
I would expect someone who's the lead engineer on that project to know every single minute detail about the file formats, the software, everything. He should, and it appears to me that he knows nothing.
It is very strange when you listen to what he says, and I think the argument would be made that he wasn't responsible for the imaging technology that was used. He was just responsible for the landing mechanism. Even so, I would expect him to have an interest in the imaging technology, because that's what his lander is being used for, to get the images, for heaven's sake. So you would expect him to be interested more enough to be able to answer that question. In fact, that's a theme in that question and answer session, isn't it? There are several questions which, to me, seem fairly, they should be able to answer them, really, and they can't answer them.
Now, which I think sheds light on how this cover-up, if it is a cover-up, and if the hypothesis is true, is operating, because I think Stelzner probably believes that thing went to Mars and landed on Mars. So it's a combination, in my opinion, it's a combination of his ego and him actually fooling himself that that's happened. So he's probably been recruited. They've maybe done a personality profile on people who they are recruiting for these lead positions, and maybe people further down the chain perhaps know that the thing isn't landing on Mars, and the vast majority of them on the team are being duped. That's just my opinion, which you'll see why I think that later on in the program.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say that when we spoke about this, and I'm still kind of hedging my bets on this one. I'm not saying that the rovers aren't on Mars.
Andrew's on the fence.
I'm definitely on the fence, and I don't mind saying that in this case. But like you say, when you stack these things up that we're looking at, it really gives you pause for thought. And I think the problem is that you think, well, what's happened to all this engineering effort? What's happened? They've spent all this money and everything, and we've got these images which are allegedly from Mars, but what really are they? What are we really seeing, and what have they really done? And that's what's hard to believe, that somehow they could have done all of this as a fake. It's hard to believe that it could have been a whole fake.
Now let's come on to the images. You mentioned the images, and let's come on to them. Just to point out, all of these images that I'm going to show you are from NASA's published websites, and I've got the reference numbers for the images, which will be put on the screen, so you can look them up yourself from NASA's website. Now, the first one we're going to look at is a Curiosity rover image, image number PIA 16204. We'll put the whole image on the screen there, and you can see I've got a little red square marked at the left hand side of the screen there, because some of the evidence in these images is quite hard to see when you look at the whole landscape. But let's just zoom in to that little area that I've highlighted there, and what do we see on the screen there between these two rocks?
Well, there appears to be a small rodent in the picture.
Right. Well, in my opinion, that's some kind of rodent, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I'd seen this picture before, actually, before we had this conversation, and it is very strange that you see that image and you think, well, is that just a chance, line of sight effect that we're seeing, or it really does look, as you say, like some type of lemming, or...
See, I originally found it in a video on YouTube, I think by Monty Williams. He thought it was a prairie dog, but if you look closely, it's not a prairie dog. I came to the conclusion that it was most likely a lemming. That's the closest match. And interestingly enough, one of the places where NASA test or claim to test and develop their rovers is in the Canadian Arctic, at a place called Devon Island, a 300-mile long deserted Arctic island, with a 23-kilometre meteorite crater in the middle of it, and there are indeed collared lemmings. It even looks like the right subspecies of lemming,
right,
with a tiny mark on its collar.
It's very, very unusual.
And lemmings have tiny little limbs, because they live in such a cold environment. They have tiny little limbs. They can kind of curl up in their own fur. And indeed, in the photo, you can't see any limbs.
Now, one of the rovers was tested. It is known that they've done tests on a place called Devon Island.
Yes.
This is the largest unpopulated island in the world, very, very remote. But one of the creatures which is resident on that island and seen regularly is the Arctic lemming. Yeah, and there's we've got a picture of one on the screen there. So, are we looking at, in the Mars image, a picture of a lemming on Devon Island? Well,
this is the question that we need to present ourselves with, don't we? And I mean, Devon Island is northern Canada, isn't it? So it's in that sort of area, so it is very remote.
Let's have a look at this next image. Again, well, I'll give the reference 0109 MR 0684 022 000E1 NASA image, and just to the right hand side there, if we zoom into that.
Well, again, it wasn't me who initially spotted it. It was somebody on YouTube saying that it looks like a backbone, like a line of vertebrae, some kind of marine species, probably.
Clearly, it's some sort of vertebrae. That's not a random rock formation, in my opinion.
I would agree with that, and I've shown that image myself in one or two of the presentations that I've done. Yes.
Pretty difficult to describe that as a random rock formation.
Yeah, exactly.
How would an image of a vertebra work itself into the Mars images? Well, again, perhaps it is somewhere like Devon Island where they've tested some of these rovers. A whale that's been beached, or one theory is that we get what are known as walrus graveyards, where hunters will come and kill a load of walruses and they'll take the tusks and all of the stuff that they want, and then they'll just leave the bodies to rot. So you'll get vertebrae lying around the ground, as we see there. And we see here on the screen a picture of a whale skeleton. So we're not biologists, so we haven't really identified what type of creature the vertebrae is from, but certainly pretty conclusive to me that that's some animal that's died, that's been on Earth.
Right, and I mean, this brings us to the point of there are a number of these images, and we're going to come on to some more. So we have two alternatives, really. Either we're looking at images from Mars, and Mars once had creatures, like whales, like walruses, going around in its oceans or seas or whatever, or we're looking at images from the Earth, which are purported to be from Mars, and either of those two gives us a problem with the official story of what's going on.
If you look at the lemming, it would say it has to have the life's the same as Earth now.
Atmosphere,
How can a lemming exist in the Martian atmosphere with what is it, less than 1%?
Minus 73 degrees centigrade or whatever.
So
there's a few other remarkably bone-like rocks that have turned up in the photographs.
Well, let's turn to that one, because we've got that one next.
The best match I could find was walrus bones.
So Douglas Gibson has actually suggested that this bone on the surface of Mars is actually a walrus arm bone.
But that walrus forearm definitely seems to be the best match.
Right, so you think...
But if anyone knows more about sea mammalian bones, happy to be corrected.
Yeah, we can see the image there of a walrus skeleton. It does look very similar to some sort of arm bone of a sea creature such as a walrus.
It does, and I mean that particular image I'd not seen before I saw it in your document, the one of this. It does look like a bone, a hip bone or a thigh bone or something, or the walrus equivalent of whatever they would call it on a walrus. Yeah, very unusual.
If they are faking it, they would have to do it in extremely remote parts of the world, and interestingly, in some of the remotest Arctic regions, what they call the Arctic desert regions of the world, you can find what they call walrus graveyards, because walruses, the early hunters a couple hundred years ago, they didn't even have to go out to sea. They could just find a huddle of walruses, because they crawl up on the land and shoot the whole lot of them and just take the tusks.
So we've got lemmings running around, we've got dead walruses and dead whales, and we've got lumps of wood. And are we really suggesting that all that life is existing on a Martian atmosphere with less than 1% of the Earth's atmosphere and carbon dioxide? It's not an atmosphere that can support life like on Earth. So where are these images really being taken?
It makes you wonder.
All right, we'll come on to the next image, which is, as I said, what appears to be a lump of wood.
That's it.
You were aware of this image, Andrew?
Yes.
Before you've seen the document, yeah.
Yeah, I mean this particular image, I'd used this in several presentations I'd done in 2000, probably 2005, 2004, that sort of time period. Not long after it had come out, I saw it posted on the internet forum, and it looks like a lump of 3x2. You know? So,
and this has come from the Opportunity rover.
yeah, and it's in a panorama image that you can find. But again, it's a black and white image. Why aren't they giving us colour? You know, as we were saying earlier on, that's
A plank of wood.
Yeah. Let's see, one of the other places, if they are using very remote places on Earth to fake it, one of the other likely locations would be Svalbard or Spitsbergen.
This is another test site.
Where they've also tested lots of Mars rovers, done lots of development work, and on Spitsbergen there are indeed quite a lot of old railway sleepers that have been washed up because there's been a lot of mining on Svalbard over the centuries.
All right, so that could be from some sort of railway sleeper, because if you were to get hazard, it doesn't look like a fallen tree. It looks like it's been.
It looks like a cut sleeper.
Andrew said a piece of 3x2.
Yeah.
what is the deal with these? Why are we getting so many black and white images? You've got phones in your pocket that take high resolution digital colour images. Why are we not getting these images from Mars?
Yeah. Okay. And another black and white image we have here, which is from the Spirit rover image. Got the reference there, which appears to show lichen.
Yeah.
It just looks like lichen. What else can it be?
Now again, if that was in colour, it'd probably be absolutely conclusive that was lichen. And we've got an image there which is comparing it to lichen on Earth. And lichen is this sort of parasite which grows on other things.
Sort of like a type of fungus, algae type of thing. I mean, the botanists, I'm sure, will pick me up and they'll tell me it's not a fungus and it's not an algae, but it's that type of growth. It's not. It doesn't really have flowering leaves or anything like that. It grows on rocks primarily. You don't really notice it growing in soils and that.
There are some kinds of lichen that actually grow in the little gaps in the rock, which you can see. And then there's a nice round one growing on the surface. I don't know exactly what the different subspecies of lichen are.
And now we come on to images of fossils.
One of the ones that Charles Schultz mentioned, which he says is a crinoid. But far more compelling really is a man called Richard Hoover, who's studied fossils all his life and worked for NASA for 40 years, and he says it is absolutely definitely a crinoid.
Right. So the guy who's working for NASA, is he therefore saying that there's crinoid fossils on Mars, or what's he saying? Or is he saying they're fooling us with images from Earth? Does he make a judgment on that?
No, he doesn't.
Right, he just says it. Okay.
Perhaps he's worried about his pension.
People who are experts on fossils have looked at this image and can conclude that it's a crinoid fossil, and we've just got it next to a crinoid fossil there, and you can see the similarities with these sort of ridges.
Isn't the logical conclusion that the photographs are coming from the Earth rather than Mars, because these are Earth species of fossils? I think the best one was a crinoid.
Yeah, I mean, this is something again I became aware of on Charles Schultz's site. Or one similar to this. Might not have been this exact image, but he had some similar images, and I've shown them in some of the talks that I've done with trilobites. And there's one that looks like a fossilized octopus that he had as well. So there's a number of these images that, and he points out, as we were saying earlier, that he'd gone through hundreds or even thousands of these images, and they're just like tiny little portions of the image. That he's picked them out from. They're not like really big, so he's had to spend a lot of time looking for them.
So Charles Schultz has written a book called The Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars, and he contends that the Martian service is got a lot of fossils on it. Therefore, there's at one point on the Earth there was microbial or life.
Complex
not
life
microbial
as well,
life, but life.
Yes.
And what we're saying in this hypothesis is, well, hang on, if someone showed you one of Charles Schultz's images, which appears to show a trilobite or a crinoid fossil, what would you think it most likely an image from? Maybe it is taken from Earth.
It's certainly possible.
Okay, now let's look at this next image, which shows a moving rock. So we've got this is from the Spirit rover. We've got one image which shows a collection of rocks, and then another image taken at a different time from a slightly different angle of the same group of rocks, and we see that there's a rock which has completely disappeared.
Right.
Which we do get sandstorms on Mars, but
well, this is it. I mean, we've already been talking, and we're going to talk probably more about the atmosphere on Mars. And I've already said it's very thin. It's much thinner than on the Earth. So therefore, any winds that are running on Mars, that are blowing on Mars, they're going to be much less kind of force on objects on the ground, because the air
less
is thinner.
than 1% the thickness of the Earth atmosphere.
Right.
So it's not going to be able to blow a rock over.
Not really. So you have a problem with that idea of this just being blown over or whatever it is.
This one's not quite so compelling. The pictures do seem very strange, but you can argue that the apparent movement of the rock is a parallax effect. That one of the rocks is actually standing quite a distance behind the other ones.
Right.
For me, again, it's more interesting because I'm pretty certain they've used CGI to hide something. The rocks themselves look quite bizarre.
All right, now there is another image that I've included in the document, which is an image of the Curiosity rover, and it's a self-portrait. So the question to be asked is, how did the thing take a photograph of itself without seeing the arm of the camera? Now, NASA have come up with an explanation for this one, and that is that there was 55 images stitched together, which made that image, and that would also possibly explain why the rocks in the background appear different on two different shots.
No, it's just too perfect. No one's quite managed to perfect the process of producing mosaics. NASA claim that they've produced some software to produce a perfect mosaic, and also none of the 55 images, which could only have been taken by the Marley lens, MAHLI, the Marley lens on the end of the robotic arm. None of those 55 images actually appear anywhere on NASA's own raw image database. And also NASA claimed that the mosaic was actually put together by an amateur astronomer, which seems to be a clever way of avoiding accountability.
And now we come on to another major area of evidence, Andrew, which is the colours on Mars.
Absolutely.
The first craft or lander was the Viking mission, and I think it was the first photograph that it sent back was image PIA 00563, which showed a blue sky and a very slightly reddish or brown foreground. NASA then said, oh well, we've made a mistake with that image, the sky isn't that colour, this is how it is. So the official images, or the revised images, is seen below there, which is just completely red. So what do you make of that, Andrew?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen many of these images now, and probably talk about one or two more, and that story of the image coming through is told by Richard Hoagland, and he said that when the image first came through on the monitors, it had like this bluish, greyish, or greyish blue, perhaps I would say, sky colour, and then somebody said, oh no, that's not right, because the dust is very thick there, and we better recalibrate this image. And they twiddled all the knobs, and lo and behold, the sky went red.
NASA's explanation why they changed that image was that there was suspended dust in the atmosphere. So they're saying that first image wasn't right because there was suspended dust in the atmosphere, so they've corrected it to the second one.
How would they know? How would they know at that point so early on?
As we'll see, NASA have been changing the colours of their images on Mars.
There's this argument been running for years about whether the sky is really red, because they can take a picture using the blue filter and tell us it was taken using a red filter. So then when we replace the red back into the picture, it looks like the sky's red when it never was.
This is from Spirit. They have actually a colour calibration module which has 4 lobes on it, and those should be blue, orange, green and brown in that image, and that's how you tell whether the image is calibrated correctly. Just tell us about that, Andy.
Yeah, so we see this on a couple of and we saw this with some of the Viking images as well, where you have this colour calibration chart, and you can see that these panels which were blue on Earth have turned red when they're on Mars. Right. Now this is not possible by reflected light. You can't, if you have a blue piece of paper or a blue piece of paint and you shine red coloured light onto it, it's not going to show up red, it's going to become like a muddy grey or something. But in these images it shows up red. And so what should be muddy grey shows up red. and that to me shows that there's been colour substitution of the blue colour range for a red colour range.
This is fairly well accepted with a lot of researchers, that they are messing with the colours on Mars, and they're deliberately making the sky look red and the ground look more red.
Yes, I mean we can say that it's Gil Levin. He's said this with analysis he's done. He designed one of the Viking experiments. Holger Isenberg, Goro Adachi. You know, I've looked at this as well. But there's been a number of people that have pointed out these anomalies.
And of course, there's two explanations, obvious explanations. The first is that the Martian sky is blue and they're trying to hide that fact and make it look red. Or it could be that the images weren't taken on Mars, they were taken on Earth, and the reason why they made them look red is so that they don't look too much like the Earth.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think a lot of the researchers who've said, hey, look, the Martian sky is blue, I think they could be barking up the wrong tree.
It's possible.
We're placing far too much faith in JPL and NASA, and I think we only need to look at their background to decide whether they're really trustworthy.